and thank you for being here. I'm truly excited. I'm excited for a conversation, and I believe you're all truly brave. Brave to have overcome the fear of the COVID-19 virus. And you're probably the right audience for me to be speaking with on this particular topic, because it does require taking some risks, but it does get you to a better place. So I'm truly excited. My session today is on evidence-based HR, achieving better results faster. And I'm Shreya Sarkar-Barney. Not to be mistaken with Solomon Smith Barney. More than a few times, people have asked if I work for Solomon Smith Barney. I am the founder of Human Capital Growth. We are a small boutique firm with bases in the US and in India and service about 12 countries each year. So in today's conversation, we're going to have a journey together. And I want to start out with a small activity for all of us. How many of your companies do town hall meetings? Yeah, probably not at this time, but in general, I'm sure you've been to a lot of town hall meetings. Now, imagine that you're in one of these gatherings, and your SVP of sales walks up to you, and let me get a name over here. Caitlin. And he says, Caitlin, thank you for what you're doing to help us meet the street's expectations. You're a publicly traded firm. Thank you for all the things that you're doing and for your contributions to the company. Then he proceeds to flag down the newly hired COO and introduces Caitlin, saying, this is the person who is enabling our sales team to meet their targets. How would you feel, Caitlin? Yeah, if you were introduced to the new COO saying, this is the person who is enabling our sales team to achieve their targets. Put on the spot? How would you all feel about this? Proud, right? Fast forward 3 months from that time, it's your annual performance management cycle time. You find out that you're the only person in HR to have gotten stock options. To have gotten stock options. How would that make you feel? If you've had that experience before, special, right? I was very fortunate that early in my career, this was the kind of experience that I had. And I think all of us should have it. All of us who work with people in organizations should have it. And that's what our conversation today is going to be about. So I hope that you're as excited as I am to go on this journey together. So what we'll talk about today is take stock of where is human capital practice or HR practices. Where are we today? What kinds of outcomes are we achieving? We'll talk about some of the reasons why we may not be getting all of the outcomes that organizations and employees truly care about. And specifically, in my journey, what I found is the two things that we really need to pay attention to is the HR operating model and our problem-solving approach. And then I'll talk about the promise of using evidence-based practices. We'll do some activities, we'll actually play some games together on making decisions. How do we really make decisions, and do we have other alternatives than the typical approaches? And I'll bring it all together with a case study and then some guidelines on how do we practice evidence-based HR. We'll have time in the end for question and answers, but I am happy to take a few questions even during the session. So if you have a burning question, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to respond to it. As I mentioned, I've been really fortunate. I've had one feet in academia and another feet in business. And people say that our lived experiences give us a unique perspective into the world. For me, I was fortunate that by accident, these two worlds came together for me. Early on in my career, I saw what it takes to build up a semiconductor manufacturing plant in record time, to help companies close the revenue gap, to turn around failing collaborations. And those experiences, combined with my time in academia, give me the confidence that we really do have the tools to achieve better results faster. So a lot of times people think evidence-based HR is about pointing fingers and telling people what you're doing wrong. That is not my intent. I think it's about all of us having a dream and knowing how to make that dream a reality, because that's my inspiration. I wouldn't be standing here today if my life hadn't changed through evidence-based practice. If I hadn't been given chances that were not based on what I look like, where I come from, but what I'm capable of. And ultimately, that's the power of using evidence. So let's take a quick stock of where human capital practices stand today. I do believe that we've made a lot of strides. If you look at accident rates have gone down since the 1970s, especially in the United States. They've gone down by 62%. There are a lot of improvements we've made, especially when it comes to parental leave. But this particular survey shows an 8-year trend, comes from the Conference Executive Board. It's a survey conducted with CEOs on what are the top challenges. I've highlighted for you the human capital challenges that show up pretty much the last 8 years. In fact, they show up the last 10 years. There's something really interesting in this chart. There is one item that has fallen off, and maybe there are some clues for us through that. Any guesses on what that item is that has fallen off this list? Well, but human capital actually has expanded to have a broader meaning, which is why you see they show up as more line items, which means that they're becoming a bigger concern. Customer relationships, what I was looking at is innovation. Innovation is the growth engine of every organization. It's very interesting to me that CEOs are no longer saying that that's not a concern. Is there any company for whom innovation is not a priority? It's a priority in every organization. What this is telling us is they've learned to get a handle on innovation. And I think the opportunities for all of us in HR, because as you can see, the line items are going up, doing the things the way we did before, it's almost like saying, let's build better irrigation systems, but that irrigation system is no longer enough. We need to come up with better ways to get better yield in HR, and that's what my goal is to talk about. Here's a really quick dashboard. I won't go into the specifics. When you talk about employee experiences, there are many areas that I think we need to move the needle a little bit further than where we are today. So I won't go into the details. I'm sure a lot of these statistics are very familiar to a lot of you. So that brings us to the question, why? Why is it that human capital growth has not only risen as one of the top concerns of the CEOs, but it's actually expanded? Why is it that despite all of the investments, we're not really moving the needle in the direction that companies want? Would you agree with me that we really do need to try some things that are different? So the answer to that why, based on my perspective of the world, lies in the picture. Anybody know what that picture represents? Sorry? Well, it's actually the Falcon 9. There is the unknown. It's the Falcon 9 by SpaceX. In 2012, SpaceX made record by sending a reusable rocket to space. This reusable rocket cut down the cost of space exploration to a fraction. It takes NASA about $2 to $3 billion to send a rocket to the space. It took SpaceX about $50 million. And in fact, they were forced to bring the price down because they were about to go under. So the only way they could attract funding is if they could come up with a better approach. So it was necessity that forced them to not think about how can we get more funding, but how can we reduce the cost of space travel. And I think that one of the lessons here is if you want to ask why and find a solution, we can look within. Because the problems that got us where we are, we can't solve the problem using the same thinking. We need inspiration from elsewhere. And for me, that inspiration comes from SpaceX and Elon Musk's thinking, and I'll get to that shortly. So I want to talk about where I see the challenges and what do we really need to work on. I know the talk is on evidence-based HR, and I'll share a personal story. I work for a large corporation, and what I found is, having spent time in academia as a tenure-track professor, I thought people were not using the science. There's just so much that we know that would allow us to be more informed. We don't have to walk in blindly. And I was very naive. When I started human capital growth 12 years ago, if only people knew the science, we would have better results. And I was wrong. My journey in 12 years has told me that we actually need a different starting place than where HR starts today. And I want to share that. The different journey happens in two places, or needs to happen in two places. One is the HR operating model, and the second is the problem-solving mechanism. So what I want to do is try and get some engagement in this room. You know, there's a lot of wisdom in this room, and I always find that we learn more from each other. And even though we have a short time together, I would love to hear from you. So we've got a pretty large full room today, so how about we try to gamify it a bit? If you would please pull out your phones, and I am going to use a polling software called Mentimeter. How many of you have used Mentimeter before? It has become one of my favorite polling softwares, and you'll know why. I think after this, you'll want to use it too. And I don't get paid by Mentimeter, by the way. This is just something I absolutely love. So go to menti.com, and you'll have an option to enter the code. Enter the numbers 842766. And all right, well, some of you have picked your numbers. I was going to say, those of you who are to my right, meaning your left, you could be green, and on this side could be blue, just so that we have a way to compare and contrast what's happening in your world. So green over here and blue over here. Just go ahead and, you know, we want to see that the tool is working for you. And you'll see some magic happen after that. All right, everyone had a chance to go into Mentimeter? Okay, so just stay with me. We're going to come back to it. How many of your HR organizations look like this? Yeah? Let's see if I can do that. All right, magic of touchscreen. Yeah? All right. Seems familiar? No?
Well, I'm all of that. Yeah.
You're all of that, which you know, that's an interesting case and maybe not bad if you're in a smaller firm. So what this structure, which is so common, enables or forces is an operating model that looks like this, where quarter by quarter you're deploying programs. Does that look familiar? Essentially what it's doing is it's forcing you to run a very efficient engine where things are very predictable, you can scale. So it's not bad, but it's designed for efficiency and scaling. The question is that what is required in organizations today? So it's questioning the fundamentals, right? The practices the reason why companies have these practices, it did serve its purpose at a time. But it may not be the best solution for what is required today. Here is a quote from Diane Gerson, who is the CHRO of IBM. It actually recently came out, and I'm like, maybe this highlights for us what is changing in our world. So she says, we used to be in a model where our goal was to be really efficient. We optimized everything for efficiency. How many people can we get through the benefits program, get them enrolled within a week? That was a measure of success, right? How many people can we put through a talent acquisition system? She says, now the game is speed to value. So how do you tune your organization for agility so that you can respond faster to external signals? The game has changed. How many of you are finding that the game has changed at your organization? It's speed to value, no longer efficiency. That means we have to play to a different end outcome. What does that end outcome look like? What I shared with you was a structure that's very centralized. It's well suited when your goal is efficiency, when your goal is to scale. I think we have to change the metrics of success in HR. And to derive the new metrics for success is speed to value, as Diane says in her quote, and it's efficiency. Well, no longer efficiency, but how quickly can you deliver value to your organization using the resources that you have, which is agility. To enable agility, we've actually seen, again, looking outside of HR, supply chain will tell you that the way they have built agility into their systems is by using what's called a hub and spoke model, or a multiple hub and spoke model. And I think there's some lessons that can be learned over there. So how about we do a poll here? Let's try to see what is the typical practice in the room over here. All right, let's get some insights. You centralized hub and spoke, multiple hub and spoke. All right, so the green team, by the way, I think was yellow, right? And the blue team, yeah, the unknown, I think, is for both of you put together. So it looks like a lot more of the blue team is voting or the green team is voting. Who's winning over here? Doesn't matter. We're all in this game together. So it's interesting that what I see this is not bad news. I see that there is a huge opportunity waiting. There's a huge opportunity waiting for all organizations. What does that opportunity look like? I think the opportunity is within our control. In HR, when we go to our line managers, when we talk to the business, how do we typically reach out to them? Well, you might say, I see that you just opened that job requisition. How many people do you need? How quickly do you need them? Right? What's your line manager going to say? Yesterday. We need it yesterday. And by the way, whatever we have, just reuse whatever you have. I don't really have time. I don't really have time to talk to you. Your world, right? How do you get them to make time for you? How do you get them to make time so you can deliver speed to value? Change the nature of the conversation. I'm not saying change what you're doing, but change your starting point. What would that look like? What does your manager care about? Most leaders, they get rewarded for improving quality, doing things fast, helping the bottom line. Anybody has a different outcome? Any of your leaders? No. They care about what's getting them paid. So where do you start the conversation? Well, I hear that we've had all these customer complaints, Is there something that we could do to help you? I think that I have some ideas. Remember that the requisition that you just opened? Maybe let's look at it, what the implications might be for helping you improve quality. You suddenly have your line manager's ears. Do you believe that will work for you? Maybe, maybe not. Try it. I think when we start our conversations with things that the business cares about today, that is the problem. That is a benefit and a problem, that when you attach your conversation to what they care about today, that has a long-term implication, you're going to get more engagement. So I'm going to move fast forward a little bit more. So what would that look like? How would you engage them in a conversation today? It's usually, where there is a lot of resources flowing in. So let's assume that your company is launching a new facility. Typically, HR sort of goes in and does their thing. Can you be in that conversation with the rest of the teams? This is what I learned very early in my life. Lucent Technologies was building a brand new semiconductor plant. And every Friday morning, all of the different departments got together. And as you walked into the building, actually, there was this huge thermometer. And the thermometer tracked how many days are left for us to reach our goal of opening that plant. So everybody knew what the goal was. And when we sat in that room with our colleagues from the other team, we knew exactly how hard each one of us had to work and where there was a give and take between each department. So the new world starts with having clarity on the business need, and then working in what might be more of a project-centric approach instead of a process-centric approach where you have predictability based on the quarterly deployment of programs. So project-centric versus process-centric. This brings me to the first takeaway. To drive better results faster, start not with what HR does best, but with what the business needs the most. And that's a very hard transition. It's a very, very hard transition. I'm no way trying to pretend like it's going to be easy, but if it starts from the top and you provoke that conversation, be more provocative in your teams. Ask, well, can we do things differently, just like SpaceX did? And maybe it will deliver different results. Second part, now that you've handled your org structure, or at least you've started to think about, can we operate in a different way? The next question is, well, how should we solve our problems? How should we solve the problems of the business? And here's a survey that The Economist did. The Economist is, I'm sure all of you have heard, a very well-known business magazine. They polled CEOs, and this particular one actually comes from 2012, but still relevant. It gives us a sense of what the business leaders think in terms of where HR can add value. And what's interesting here is looking at the first bar, what the CEOs believe is that HR is too focused on the processes and the rules of the organization, and not as much focused on the big picture. May or may not be true for everyone. This is what was true for the companies that were polled. Where I see huge opportunity is in that fourth line. HR behaves more like an independent advisor and service provider rather than a fully invested member of the management team. I think that's really powerful. HR has always been rewarded for being a service provider, right? What does that look like? A leader comes to you and says, I need this right now. What are we rewarded for? How quickly do you do it? How cost effectively do you do it? But what this survey is saying is that we have the permission to say, can we talk about that? Is that really that urgent, or should we be paying attention to something else? It's about what permissions we give ourselves. I think we have to give ourselves the permission to say, just because you're asking for something doesn't mean that I have to deliver it. Maybe it's not the best thing for the company. So my invitation to you is give yourself the permission to push back, to ask that question. We did a few surveys to understand where does HR find the solutions that they use and where do they spend their time. And I'm going to go through this data quickly, happy to discuss it in detail with anyone. This is data that comes from about 300 HR professionals. We asked them, how do you find solutions? And about a third, more than a third of them said, well, when we have a need in the company, we ask others in my organization. Another survey we did, we asked L&D teams, how do you spend your time? And they tell us, actually up to 50% of them said, well, we spend our time mostly developing content. And essentially not as much time in understanding the needs of the business. And I think there is a real opportunity here. Again, the things that we got rewarded for, we have to teach the business. You know what? I'm going to be spending my time differently. It's about teaching your stakeholders that I'm going to show up in a different way. And where is that opportunity? Before I get to that, here is another survey. We do, every other year, we do a talent development benchmark study. About 60% of the participants in these studies are companies that have over 50,000 employees. So these are very large, well-endowed organizations. And what our goal in these benchmark studies is not to see where companies are spending their money, but we want to understand how many of the evidence-based practices for which we know that you can get big gains, quantified gains, how many of these practices are getting used in organizations. This chart is really interesting because if you look at those bubbles with the red numbers, those are the numbers that show if you use that practice, how much gain can you get. And what the chart shows is companies spend way too much effort in low-gain practices. The upside of using evidence-based practice is huge. And I'm going to actually leave you with just 3 practices that will help you drive huge predictive outcomes in your organization. That's the power of evidence-based practice. I'm going to get to that soon. Again, I'll talk more about this. If you want to talk about the survey, I'm happy to do that later. The idea here is that companies are actually not using all of the knowledge that is available to us. And essentially, that is knowledge that is in the open source. This is not proprietary knowledge. That's why I'm excited to talk to you about it, because this is all data that's available to you. So essentially what we're seeing today is companies are asking each other, either within the firm, asking others, how are you solving your problem? And essentially they're using what innovation experts call solution finding. The problem, I'm going to get to the problem with that. Instead, what innovation experts like Min Basadur, who is the well-known expert in that field, Clayton Christensen, who recently passed away, they recommend spending more time in problem finding. What's a meaningful problem to solve? And if you solved it, what's the biggest upside to the organization, to employees? And I think we have to shift our thinking. Don't respond to every request that comes to your desk. And if we did that, we would move from having or making incremental gains that comes from solution finding. The challenge with solution finding, what NASA was doing, is that you're switching out one problem for the other. When you focus on problem finding, that's where disruptive breakthroughs happen. And if you recall in the data that I showed, most COEs, which is L&D, talent management, they spend most of their time building programs instead of investing in what is the biggest problem I can solve for my company. The path forward is using more evidence-based practice. So this brings me to takeaway number 2. To drive better results faster, spend more time in problem finding rather than solution finding. All right, so this brings us to the promise of evidence-based HR, the thing that you came here to hear. We can't really do evidence-based HR until we've done the last 2 things. And that's been my lesson learned the hard way. Hopefully, it will be easier for you. that to find the right problems to solve, you have to have a different operating structure where you are invited to the conversations where those problems emerge. So the benefit, the promise of evidence-based HR, let me take a quick sort of raise of hands in this room. If anyone wants to volunteer, what does evidence-based practice mean to you?
So, for example, if we're talking about, client experience and high turnover, I would want to look at engagement rate, right? I would also want to look at turnover percentages, right? Are the key performers leaving the company? And then, of course, talk to the managers to understand, delve deep between what's activity happening, what are the solutions, right? First, like you said, find out what the problems are that's creating, that's impacting our key performance in the organization, and then
Yeah. So what you're suggesting is using data and company data to understand your problem better. Let's take a look at a few other perspectives. Evidence-based HR, in my view, is an elegant and innovative consultation approach. It's about using data, but it's also a consultation approach, which is why your conversations matter a lot. What type of conversations are you having with your organizations? And this consultation approach helps you achieve better results faster. And I'll share that with you. I'll share a case study with you to show how I've helped companies do that. So essentially, evidence-based HR is about being business-focused, find the biggest problem the business is facing, leaning on the science, being science-informed and analytics-driven. So it's an expansion of what you just mentioned. It's analytics-driven because the data comes later. A lot of times, you don't have enough data to even know what your biggest problems are. Evidence-based HR is not just restricted to HR. In fact, way back in the 70s, medical science moved to what's called a shift from eminence-based medicine to evidence-based medicine. Eminence-based used to be, doctors sort of using their own judgment and saying, here's what I think works. Evidence is about using hundreds and hundreds of studies to say, here's what I think works. And evidence-based practice is now used in manufacturing, in nursing. It's not just something that is relevant to HR. It really does have broad appeal. And in fact, it is what has helped the quality movement in the US, which is why quality is not on that list of concerns of CEOs. So evidence-based HR, I've actually modified the definition of what is evidence-based management to come up with this. It's a conscious effort to use the best available evidence, ideally rigorous scientific evidence, to make decisions about employees and practices in managing the workforce. And I'm going to illustrate this. So typically, most HR solutions start with someone in the organization making a request and you figuring out how to fulfill that, right? Can we change that cycle? To change the cycle, start with what's the desired outcome. And the desired outcome, if you recall the chart with the squares, it's usually something related to the business. The cost, quality, cycle time, it's a handful of things that every company cares about. Productivity, profitability, brand, employee engagement. So you start out with what's the goal and what's the problem? What's keeping us from achieving those goals? That's where problem finding comes in. Once you've done that, you've done your homework, you've built a fertile ground to do the next part, which is how do I find the solution that will remove the barrier, close the gap between our goals and what we want to accomplish. What that requires is a new way of thinking, a new way of making decisions that's not just about asking people, what are you doing today? And I'm going to actually demonstrate that with the help of an exercise, all right? So imagine that you've been given $100 to advance leadership capabilities in your organization. Common need in every company, right? And assume that the $100 is, think of it like a pie chart. You can distribute it like percentages. How will you allocate those funds across the programs? And we're going to go back to Mentimeter. And we will play this game actually in teams. So the blue team can just type in words. You have 3 choices, just type in words. Here's how I'm going to spend my $100, whatever you think needs to be done. And then I'm going to ask the green team that same question next. So blue team, this is all the blue team here? All right. Well, if you've entered, the green team's entered, don't worry. You can enter it again. But let's give the blue team some time, and you'll start to see why I love Mentimeter so much. All right. Training, engagement, coaching, strategic thinking. That's actually really, really interesting. There's a lot of great stuff here. How about let's pause over here. I'm going to move to the green team. Anything else, you want to put the same things, different things? That's all right. Empowerment. That seems like a lot of people have empowerment over here. There you go. We can see. Ask for requests, analyze needs. I love that, analyze needs. I see the connection between what we're talking about. Coaching, training. So we're seeing a lot of things emerge. Analytics. Okay, all right. So we're getting, what I saw a lot of was things like training, coaching, engagement. Does that feel like the general theme between the two groups? Now let's see what the science has to say. All right. Here is a chart I put together looking at meta-analytic evidence. Pay attention to the word meta-analyses, because that's going to be your secret. That's going to be the secret weapon that you will have to have more insights than other people. This particular chart shows what aspects of leader effectiveness is impacted the most by these various factors. So if you wanted to move the needle on leadership effectiveness, where should you invest to get the biggest rate of return? These are statistically quantified numbers. They're called variance explained. Anybody who is, if you're familiar with statistical language, it's R squares. This data, by the way, exists in the open source. Every one of us in this room has access to it. What it shows is about 30% of leader effectiveness is predicted by the qualities of the person you've hired, which is why it is so important to assess the people that are in the leadership positions. Attributes that you hire them for, usually a lot of them are things that you cannot move the needle on through more training. They are hardwired. There's plenty of evidence. It's not things that I'm making up. But through decades of studies, we know that there are some human attributes that we cannot move the needle on, which is why you have to assess and select people for it. And 30% of leadership effectiveness is determined by that. Now, a lot of you said training. Some things actually can be developed by training. Actually, a good portion of leadership, if you hired well, a good portion of leadership can actually be trained. So it's a good place to invest in, provided you have picked the right people. So let's do another exercise. And let's say that you ask around and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing some leadership training in my company. Which type of training are you using? Which one works? All right, so here, let's say that you have these choices. Everyone heard of these different types of training frameworks, right? You might have a favorite in here. And it's really hard to tell which one works and which one doesn't, right? Everyone's had good experiences and bad experiences with all of these. Now, what I've learned over the years is when you just put labels like that, it actually is not a good idea because we all have different definitions of what is inside them, particularly transformational leadership, because the word is such a generic word. When it comes to evidence-based practice, one of the key lessons is definitions matter. How we define things really matter, which is why I'm putting this up. Which one would you pick? Any favorites in the room? Anyone want to kind of just throw a name out? Sorry, authentic? Situational? Yeah. If you do a Google search, actually situational leadership has the most number of searches. So if you went just by data, you would pick situational leadership. Right, right. You want to see the data? Sorry?
It's a little overused right now,
the word, but it has very specific meaning and people don't really define it the way it's intended. It has actually the most rigorous scientific evidence. There is over 150 countries that have participated in these studies that was led by Bob House at University of Pennsylvania. For over 2 decades, there is overwhelming evidence that this particular framework of leadership truly moves the needle on effectiveness. Now, the other interesting thing over here is, let's say, whoopsie, I put out the dollars over here. What's interesting is that if you invested in leadership training, you're still only moving the needle about 14% at best. If that's the only thing you did, you still have a lot more work to do to help your leaders be fully equipped. And when we have numbers, when we have evidence, we no longer need to walk around blindly, right? That's the power of using this evidence. And I'm going to talk about where this data comes from. So, okay, well, I think I have a little bit more time. We could do one more exercise. One more? Do you want to practice another decision making? Yes? Okay, let's do another one. Every company does talent acquisition, right? So let's now, you know what, my activity, here's what I'm thinking. Let's all do just one poll. Because you can see each other's responses, so let's say that you're all doing this together, responsible for making hiring decisions. What tools would you use to make hiring decisions? Things that you use in your company for talent acquisition to decide who is a candidate we move forward with, who do we hire, what tools. And so blue team and green team, we'll do this all together so we can move along faster. Assessments, referrals, interviews. This is a good list. Multiple interviews, panel interviews, lots of different types of interviews, behavioral questions, right? I want to pay close. Referral programs, values fit. This is great. And by the way, all of this data gets saved, so I'm going to have a field time looking at the details in here. Wonderful. But interviews and assessment, we're starting to see some strong patterns here. 3 things that stand out. Assessments, referrals, and interviews. Let's take a look at what the data has to say. All right, the reveal. Interviews. How good are interviews, no matter what format you use? Not that great, right? Not that great. They're definitely easy to do. I'm not recommending getting rid of them. It's definitely better tools. But before I get to that, what's interesting is how many of you ask about years of education? Right? Years of experience. Every company that I know of asks about this data. What is the predictive value of that data? Turns out it's actually not that great. And I look at this and I think, wow, what a huge opportunity, right? What a huge opportunity when we have 2% unemployment rate. How do we find the best candidates? Maybe we need to change the frame that we are using to even build our pool of candidates. And I think there's a huge opportunity for all of us. So what the studies show, and this comes from a meta-analysis from 1998, a long time ago, which was replicated actually just last year again. The data hasn't changed. The findings haven't changed. So according to these studies, when you compare all of these methods, work sample tests give you the most predictive information. They can explain about 30% of the variance of who's going to be your better performance. Interestingly, there are a lot of companies that do use them. That's one of the kind of work that we do around the world, is we help companies have enough insights into the leaders they're looking to bring in from the outside or looking to promote. And we use what's called assessment centers, which I saw noted there, lots of assessments, business case analyses, role plays, about a day and a half worth of data. And having done this work for over a decade, I'll tell you, some of the companies that we've been working on for many, many years, the managers say we will not make a hiring decision without having that additional insight. So work samples are basically, if you want to know how good someone's going to be in the job, have them do that. Have them do parts of that job and see how good they are. The other piece is general mental ability, intelligence. Intelligence has stood out as one of the biggest predictors of job performance, but it has some downsides. And if anyone's interested, I can talk about that and some ways to alleviate it. So essentially, the kinds of data that I showed exist for a lot of different practices. Here you see our human capital growth model of integrated talent management, or think of it as strategic HR. We track these kinds of scientific evidence for 17 practice areas. This is data that exists in scientific journals that all of us have access to. If you're willing to invest the time to read the journals, you can get access to it. And increasingly, the world is seeing the power of these insights. I feel very fortunate. I've been at this for the last 12 years, partly because my life changed when companies used evidence to make decisions about me. And I was also hurt when companies didn't, when they made decisions about the way I looked. The decision made based on the way I looked. It's been my mission to help spread the power of evidence-based practice. And I'm very fortunate to have been recognized among a group of other 28 scientist practitioners just last year. The point I want to make is that industry is finally starting to see the benefit, the power of this practice. And let me let you into a secret. So subsequent to that, I was appointed to the advisory board of our editorial board of our organization's Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology. I'm now on the editorial book of the Professional Practice series, and was asked to edit a book that catalogs how companies are using some of the largest findings that have the largest evidence, the largest gains. And as I've been in this journey to find organizations to help write the case studies, let me let you into the secret. The ones that are actually using the science and getting extraordinary findings will not share those publicly. Why? Why? It's their secret sauce. It's their secret sauce, but you can have it too. You can have it too. It's an investment. So my hope is that we'll have enough people, hopefully in a couple years from now, this book will be released. I'm optimistic. How do you practice it? So the 2 points I want to make: not all evidence is created equal. And that's the number one thing. When we look at benchmark studies, we have to be a critical consumer. This is a pyramid of evidence that is used in medical science, in any practice that uses evidence-based thinking. And what you'll find is there's things at the bottom: qualitative case studies, anecdotes. not the most high quality evidence. If you look at the quality of evidence, editorials, opinions, ideas, things that show up in a lot of the magazines, these are useful to know what others are doing, what your competition is sharing with you, for you to know, may or may not be doing it. How do you get better evidence? To get better evidence, you really need more of what's called experimental studies. And a lot of companies are actually doing experimental studies. We know famously of Google and others. It is possible for you to do your own experimental studies. But in the field of behavioral science, particularly related to the workplace, we actually have over 100 years of research studies that we can now draw from, particularly inspired during World War II, where a lot of this research started to get a boost. The aggregation of those studies is what's called a meta-analysis. Any single study could be wrong. Even in medical science, you might have a single study that says, well, if this particular treatment condition reduces the risk by 10%. What you really want to look for is aggregation over multiple studies, and ideally studies that have randomized control experiments, which is one group gets the medication or the treatment or special training, the other group doesn't get it. You compare the two. So the power of the data that I shared, they all come from meta-analyses. The meta-analyses exist today. If you want to access it, go to scholar.google.com, do a meta-analysis for whatever you're interested in, engagement, turnover, you'll find a bunch of studies. Now, they're not the easiest to read, but if you sit through it, you might at least read the abstract. You will be better informed than if you were just going blindly at it. So here is another poll. And I want to ask you the question. All right. So here's a survey of different journals or sources that have evidence-based content. And select the ones that you think are the best source for getting evidence-based content. So if you can do it together, we'll get to see your results as the blue team and the green team. 20 minutes, okay. All right. Well, this is really interesting. We have a clear majority. Harvard Business Review. You ready for the surprise? Academy of Management and Personnel Psychology, the only peer-reviewed scientific journals here. Anybody can publish in Harvard Business Review. It is not peer-reviewed. If you send in an article, which is why you can do this exercise yourself. You can do a search on diversity training. You'll get a variety of perspectives. The same things that someone is proposing, you'll find other studies, other articles that say is the wrong thing to do. Which is why I'm sending you to scholar.google.com, because it's an aggregation of research studies. I'm going to be honest with you and say they're not fun to read because they're dry. They're scientific studies. Companies like ours, we do the translation, make it palatable, but you don't have to rely on us. You can do it yourself. Personnel Psychology and Academy of Management, your papers have to be reviewed by other experts in that particular domain. And even more so, scientific publishing is changing. You now have to submit your data to show how did you get your findings, and someone else can reanalyze that. So there is more rigor compared to even psychology today. Psychology today, I think, has some great content, but can you rely on it completely? Probably not. The other thing before we go on to the case study, the other thing I want to share with you is when you're consuming evidence-based data, no matter where it comes from, even a scientific journal, numbers matter. So if I told you your blood pressure was 300 by 150, what are you going to tell me? How come you're standing? Oh, you should have colored. That's not even a possible number, right? Why is that? Because we know what the range should be. And now if I tell you a multi-year study, this is a true story, a multi-year study at company name blanked out, found that emotional intelligence predicts 47% of the variance in performance. Gets you excited? Yeah? You're going to go invest in emotional intelligence training? A number like that, no matter what it says, should get us concerned. There's one thing I want to leave you with. Years and years of study have shown that a single variable can explain no more, even the best studies explain no more than 30% of the variance. This, unfortunately, was in a very popular HR magazine that millions of people read. We have an expert panel, one of my academic colleagues pointed out this study to me, that this is be a critical consumer. Just because we love numbers doesn't mean all numbers point us in the right direction. So this brings us to what I had promised, 3 practices that are easy to use, that have high gains, that will give you a big lift in what you're trying to do. So let's say that you use level 1 evaluations in your training. How many of you use surveys to measure training effectiveness? Everybody, right? How many of you asked the question, were you satisfied with the training? A lot of companies do. If you don't, let me give you an alternative. Ask the question, was this training useful to you? Different wording. Was this training useful to you? Not satisfied. Or did you get any utility from this training? That particular change has been found to explain 21% of the variance on transfer of training, on who uses their knowledge at the end of the course. What it allows you to do is to pull aside those people who may need some extra reinforcement based on how they responded to that question. It has huge predictive value. Goal setting. Every company uses goal setting, SMART goals, right? New evidence on goal setting shows that instead of asking people to set SMART goals, what if you use goal priming? Goal priming is to help people anchor what's a good number. And that's where prior analytics helps. Say last year we achieved 130% of our target. What if we up that by 10%? It helps people achieve better goals. Talent acquisition. There's a lot of research, interestingly, on talent acquisition, which most companies will treat the process as bringing in the candidate pool and selecting a people. If you chose to give them different information depending on the phase in the talent acquisition process, you might have the ability to convert more qualified candidates into qualified employees who actually accept your job offer. The way to do that is to present more company-related information up front and job fit-related information when they are making the choice about whether I pick this job or not. Try it out and let me know. If you want to stay in touch, let me know if that works for you. All right, so takeaway number 3, to drive better results faster, ask not what are the others doing, but what should I invest in to get the biggest return on my talent investment? If you're working with vendors, ask them the question, how much return can I expect if I do this? A lot of companies will ask who else is doing this. I'm not saying don't ask that, because I know you need that for social proof to sell it to your leaders, but also ask them how much of a lift am I going to get? And if they say 47%, what are you going to do? Run. Okay. Next, I'm going to share a case study on one particular company, or particular company that I work with that achieved some pretty good outcomes using this approach. Now, this is a mid-sized software firm based on the Midwest. It has been acquired multiple times since. The CEO put out a mandate that said, put more feet on the street to close the revenue gap. Put more feet on the street to close the revenue gap. By the way, this was an excellent mandate. You know why? Why was this a good mandate? The CEO didn't say we need more sales training. It was a problem statement. It was a very, very clear problem. So the business challenge was that it was a publicly traded firm. They were at risk of not meeting analyst expectations. The mandate from the leadership was to expand the sales team, increase revenue and profitability, and meet revenue targets in less than 12 months. And what were the barriers to achieving the outcome? So the goal was clear. If you remember the cycle of evidence-based practice, the goal was clear. The barriers were we had to close the revenue gap in 2 quarters, but it took 6 months to onboard new sales team. So if you wanted more people going out and selling, it takes 6 months just to get people up to speed. And people have different levels of skills in selling the company's products, and there's lack of insight. The sales leaders didn't really have insight into the capabilities of each of the individuals in their sales team. How do you close that gap? We looked at the scientific evidence. What's the best way to help reduce the onboarding time and reduce the time to productivity, which is one of the metrics of onboarding? Socialization. Socialization techniques have shown that when people know whom to go to when they get stuck, it reduces time to productivity. Put that into practice. Variable skill levels. We put people through development opportunity, but collected data on what is the actual knowledge gain and skill gain. Insight on performance. Set up clear goals. Talk about goal priming. Help people set goals on what the company thought would be achievable, but was a stretch. 30, 60-day plans. So here, this one shows what was the solution. We outlined the problems, found evidence-based practice, and then I'll get to the results. Put more feet on the street. Now, what happened here was really interesting because it exemplifies that new HR operating model I was talking about. Now, this was a mandate that the CEO put out to his leadership team, and the mandate was explained as we need to increase sales. How do you increase sales? Well, it could have been a training challenge. It could have been a challenge to the sales team. Just go out, spend more time on the street. But in this case, it was a cross-functional team that was responsible for addressing it. Again, the challenges were onboarding took too long, leaders didn't have insight into the skills and what their people were doing. How did we address that? We put together a 2-week-long boot camp. Remember, the 6 months to close the revenue gap, you can have training that is 6 months long. Quick and dirty boot camp. Company had grown through acquisitions. There were 97 products. We had to get all of these products sort of all pulled together to say, okay, here's what you need to learn. But essentially, we did 2 things. We pulled together the experts, did the training, did a lot of things. But the 2 most important things that paid out was everybody had to take a test at the end of their training. Imagine salespeople taking a test on the product. You can't sell if you don't know the product. Second thing we did, we reached out to the top sales leaders and said, give us scenarios that you encounter in the business, the hardest scenarios. And we put together a panel evaluation. The senior leaders sat in a room, and the new recruits had to pitch how they would actually solve that challenge. We had lots and lots of data. They also had 30, 60, 90-day, 360-day plans, goals. Interestingly, you would think that this would have taken a long time. It was 6 months from start to finish. What were the results? 6 months after, what was unique about this effort was we gave the scores of the test and the panel evaluation to the managers. We didn't tell them anything. We just said, here is the top quartile, bottom quartile, middle of the group that you just put through the boot camp. After 6 months, the bottom quartile was gone. We have no idea if it was because it was based on the scores. Leaders made those decisions. Interestingly, the revenue gap closed. Business started to trend up. The business was sold after 18 months for 3x the revenue. Happy ending, quick turnaround. Using the evidence, we could pinpoint where exactly we needed to invest our effort and energy. So why was this unique? Well, what was different? I didn't realize what was different about this experience. It felt like yet another project. But the more I worked with companies and saw what worked and didn't work, what was insightful, or what became more visible to me, is that a lot of times our HR dashboard doesn't reveal where the problem is. As HR, we can't be the ones that are pushing an effort. We have to be part of the team, just like I showed that data. And some things don't scale. Remember, speed to value, also the trade-off that we have to make sometimes is some things just don't scale. And we have to be okay with that. Because if the business need was addressed, then that's what's more important than having things that can be repeated multiple times. So this brings me to some important myths, things that you might encounter if you choose to go down this path. What you might encounter is people say it takes too long. It takes too long to take an evidence database approach. Have you heard that before? I would say most of our effort is actually been the opposite. It takes shorter because you're starting with prior evidence, what has been known for many, many years. It does undermine formal authority because you can't just say, because I said so. So it is threatening to some, and that is a real threat. And some may say, well, evidence needs to provide exact answers, and it doesn't. It gives you a ballpark figure, a near about figure. Your results are going to be in that range, but it doesn't guarantee exact results. A few years ago, KPMG in the UK did a survey to understand why companies were not adopting evidence-based practices. And what they found is actually it's not data or it's not infrastructure, which you often hear, right? Companies will say, if only we had enough data, we could do more, we could have better ability to do evidence-based HR. It's actually the culture, it's the mindset, which is why your structure really matters. Your structure matters, your problem-solving approach really matters. Data is easy to come by. You can collect the data. So I'm going to go through some of these slides rather quickly, and by the way, you have access to them as well. I don't think we have to take more time. What I want to leave you with is these important set of questions. The one thing that you can change leaving this room is when you go to a meeting, ask these 6 questions. How do we know this is the right problem to solve? What do we start doing, stop doing? And if we did what you're proposing, what is the biggest gain we can get? Simply by asking the question, perhaps you'll start to move the needle. In summary, what I'm going to say is, you now have the framework, you now have hopefully a new lens. But at the end of the day, how do you shape the culture? Don't forget to celebrate. When we celebrate, we do something that's really important. We reinforce what's worked. We help shape culture. So the things that we've talked about challenging your HR operating model, using a different approach to problem solving, do stop to recognize the small successes and the big successes. Let me get to my invitation to you. My invitation to you is be bold. This is our time. It's our time in HR to make big difference, which is why when we looked at the CEO challenges, the line items related to human capital are only increasing. It is our time to actually deliver that impact, and it is within our reach. And within our reach, not just to help corporations, but to create fair and equitable workplaces. So we're Human Capital Growth, have the privilege of working with a lot of different firms. If any of this interested you, we do a lot of free webinars. We have a lot of resources because it is my mission to help spread evidence-based practice. Feel free to reach out either through this, these are again in the folder, or reach out to me directly. I'm on LinkedIn. We do a lot of events that you can just sign up for through webinars, bringing industry leaders who are explaining how they are using evidence-based practice.